Thank you very much, Priyanka. And I must thank, of course, Dr. Alak Sharma and his colleagues at the IHD for inviting me to deliver this valedictory lecture at this important international conference on inclusive and sustainable development in the Global South. I'm thanking him rather than cursing him for trapping me into this task, which has, and giving me the burden of doing this valedictory lecture, because after almost 30 years of not doing any work on urban development, this gave me a chance, an opportunity to think a little bit again on issues in urbanization and urban development. However, I may be totally out of date, so what I say might be also 30 years old. But as Dr. Sharma said, my PhD dissertation was indeed on urban development and economic development and structural change. And I'm sort of amazed that he actually knew the title of my dissertation. And since he mentioned the title, actually he didn't give the full title. So I may as well burden you with the full title. It was, as he said, Development, Structural Change and Urbanization, Explorations with a Dynamic Three-Sector General Equilibrium Model Applied to India 1951 to 1984. So, of course, as a young fellow doing the thesis in the early 70s, early to mid 70s, I thought 1984 was a long way away. So I thought I was doing a long simulation of urban development and economic development. But of course, 1984 is now 39 years ago. So it wasn't that far away when I did it. So my first professional work for almost 12 years plus, from 1974 onwards, was indeed in this area, including an assignment in the Planning Commission from 1981 to 1983. In those days, I, in some sense, slept and ate urban development. I was not interested in anything else. And when I joined the World Bank, it was really in the urban research department. And I was just not interested in anything else that the World Bank was doing. So I'm delighted that you have devoted 3 days to this conference, which suggests a new level of importance being given to concerns related to urban development. I say this because I left this area in the mid to late 1980s, an area that I was indeed passionate about, because I found even by the late 1980s that no one in India was interested in urban development. So I thought I'd better do something else, because it was a lonely furrow where I was working. So let me, since I'm history myself, let me start with some reflections on a brief history of urbanization. But I guess since you're all specialists, you probably know all of this. So what is interesting in a way is that most of us have been urban residents throughout our lives. So we give little thought to how new the phenomenon of towns and cities is. Urbanization, that is the emergence of towns and cities, and their continuing growth, is now seen by all of us as a very natural process. We're just used to it. The fact is that in a historical framework, the experience of living in towns and cities is relatively new in a historical sense. It is mainly a 20th century phenomenon, of course, going forward to 21st century and onwards. In 1900, the level of global urbanization was only 15%, which of course was a significant rise from the 2% level 100 years earlier. So in other words, 1800, the level of urbanization was 2%, which means that prior to 1800, for times immemorial, urbanization was negligible. And so in that sense, this is really a new historical experience. In terms of numbers, there were only about 250 million urban residents at the turn of the 20th century. there were only about, by the turn of the millennium, that is the next century in 2000, global urban population had shot up in 100 years from 250 million to about 2.9 billion, an increase of 2.1 billion actually in the previous 50 years, that is from 1950 to 2000. And that, of course, so there was a remarkable acceleration, number of towns and cities and an urban population during the 20th century, accelerating in the next second half of the 20th century. What is interesting is that the expectation is, and we already in 2023, from 2000 to 2030, is that the accretion to urban population would be about the same magnitude in 30 years as it was in the previous 50, that is from 1950 to 2000. So there's again a huge acceleration in urbanization. And about 2/3 of the increase is actually happening in Asia. So we are living in a period of the fastest addition to urban population in world history. In terms of percentage growth, however, it is somewhat slower than in the last century because of a higher base. What I find remarkable, and that's why I'm so happy to see this conference taking place over 3 days, and that all of you have survived the 3 days to be here on a Saturday evening. I'm amazed you have nothing better to do on a Saturday evening than listening to me. That despite this unprecedented phenomenon, I don't get a sense of unprecedented attention being devoted to urbanization than one might have expected at the present time, either in academic or policy circles. Dr. Ramesh Chand, whereas you're a member of Niti Aayog, I don't know what all things you're in charge of, certainly of agriculture, I've not heard of anyone in the Niti Aayog even thinking for 2 minutes in a day about urban development. So it's incredible. This is the fastest period of urbanization in human history. And people are not, I don't get that sense. I'm not sure if this perception on my part is excessively by the Indian experience, or is it true to other fast urbanizing countries also? So coming to India, where are we in India in this context? Although the world itself crossed the 50% level of urbanization, in some sense a historic mark, around 2006-07, Indian urbanization is only about 35-36% now. We cannot be sure what the number is, since the 2021 census has not yet begun, a break from the regular decennial census that has been carried out in India regularly since 1861. And perhaps, Dr. Ramesh Chand, when you speak and tell us why we're being deprived after 160 years of regular decennial census, because that doesn't give us much information to talk about today. The Indian urbanization went up from about 11% in 1900 to only about 28% at the end of the century, a period during which global urbanization was not that different, 15% in 1900, 11% in India, to almost 50, not quite, almost 50% by 2000. But India had only gone up 28%. So India was not a major participant in the new phenomenon of urbanization in the 20th century. To put matters in context, the level of Chinese urbanization in 1980 was around 20%, just a bit less than that of India, and 23%. It reached almost 50% by 2010, a couple of years later, when India's level had reached only about 31%. So the current expectation is that India's urbanization level will not cross 50% until around 2050. So our rate of growth, urban growth, has been somewhat slower than what might have been expected. On the one hand, many people celebrate the fact that we have been urbanizing slowly. People say, how would we have coped if our towns and cities had grown even faster? I'm glad that Dr. Sharma talked about urbanization in a much more positive sense than has been the case here for a long time. On the other hand, my question is our slow urbanization a cause for worry in terms of quality and speed of the development process? So let me now just connect to urbanization and economic development, because that's really the key issue. I already talked about the fact that my dissertation was indeed on that, so it's a subject close to my heart and mind. The structural change in the development process has always been associated with the transfer of people from agriculture to manufacturing and from rural areas to urban areas. This is then associated with the acceleration in economic growth, since productivity in manufacturing is typically a multiple of that in agriculture. In fact, as labor moves from agricultural pursuits to different kinds of urban pursuits, the average productivity in agriculture in rural areas also goes up as the population, as the labor force in agriculture comes down, thereby adding to economic growth. The process of urbanization is therefore associated with higher economic growth. I think I'm right in saying, but other experts would have a clearer idea. I think we are finally beginning a period in which our rural population will actually start declining, which hasn't happened before. I think we're about at that period. However, it's now being realized, and people are talking about much more and writing about much more, that the transfer of labor from agriculture is simultaneously to manufacturing and services, which are typically located in urban areas. To some extent, as in the Indian census, urban areas are defined as such by the presence of these activities and the absence of agriculture. I'm delighted to say that I was much earlier in the game. That is, the key characteristic of the model I developed in 1975, 76, 77 was indeed to point out the simultaneous transfer of labor to both manufacturing and services. I'm delighted to see that people have caught up with me after 46 years. But I'm also sad to see that I didn't make much more about it at that time. The share of services is now much more than that of manufacturing everywhere in the world, every country just about, in both value-added and employment, both in advanced economies and developing countries alike. However, fast urbanization, really fast urbanization, has still been associated with high growth in manufacturing, as exhibited by countries in Southeast and East Asia. The remarkable growth of Japan, South Korea, and later China and other countries has been associated with corresponding fast urbanization and of manufacturing. The dramatic growth of manufacturing and exports in China, along with urbanization from 20% in 82 to almost 50% by 2010 and 65% now, bears witness to this phenomenon. The relatively slow growth of both manufacturing value added and manufacturing employment in India can perhaps explain the corresponding slow rate of urbanization in the country. The share of manufacturing value added now has fallen from 17-18% in the early 1990s to less than 15% now, and is now less than the share of agriculture in value added in GDP. While India's urbanization trend has followed the standard script of continuously increasing over time, there seems to be a break in trend as far as urban share of income is concerned. This came as a surprise to me that according to official estimates, the share of urban GDP in the total was stagnant at about 52% from 1999 to 2012, according to official statistics. This was pointed out to me by my colleagues, Shishir Gupta and Ashley Jose, who are my colleagues at CSEP, estimate this proportion is around 55% now. Moreover, it is reported by some researchers, like my friend Ijaz Ghani, formerly from the World Bank, that the share of rural areas in organized manufacturing has actually been increasing in recent decades. If this is correct, this would explain slowing urban growth in India over the last 3 or more decades. It is also quite inconsistent with the experience elsewhere in both advanced and developing economies, historically and in contemporary experience. Furthermore, in India, industrial growth has been relatively more capital intensive and not labor using, leading to relative stagnancy in employment in organized manufacturing. There also appears to be evidence that manufacturing in urban areas is actually getting more informalized and hence exhibiting slowing productivity, leading to slow income growth in urban areas and urbanization. That's the only way I can understand the data that my colleagues brought to my attention. It is important both for the health of our cities and for the Indian economy in general that more research is done to understand this rather strange phenomenon of industrialization and urbanization in India, quite inconsistent with other fast-growing countries, and of crucial importance for development and welfare, social welfare in our country. Casual empiricism suggests that the lack of growth in quality employment could be leading to, of course, higher rates of unemployment, particularly among the educated young, whose numbers have grown almost exponentially since the turn of the millennium. The increasing occurrence of social tensions and resulting violence at the drop of a hat may also be a consequence of inadequate management output and employment growth in our cities. Let me now go to the issue of large cities, which Dr. Alak Sharma had also referred to. There were 50, just to get some numbers, to always start with some numbers, there were 52 million plus cities in India according to 2011 census. Without the 2021 census, we can only estimate how many there are now. Most projections seem to suggest there are probably about 65 million plus cities now. In China, in comparison, there are already about 115 or so. According to current expectations, India will reach such a number, about 115 million plus cities by 2050, which is where China is today. Even with the existence of 65 million plus cities, it is now imperative that more policy attention should be given to the emergence of such cities and their continued expansion. Are they good for us? Should we encourage them? How do we make them more productive? Again, this is something that Dr. Sharma alluded to. And the key point is very significant need for institutional change is what he argued for. The key point also is that large cities, we need to understand, increase overall economic productivity, which leads to higher income, potentially greater social welfare, and the quality of living. A great deal of research across the world suggests that productivity increases with city size, contrary to popular impression. It has been estimated that in the US, for example, wages rise by 6% as city density doubles. It would happen if the cities become larger. Why does this happen? Mostly because of agglomeration economies. People benefit in many ways by being around other people. Face-to-face contact is very important for both personal lives as well as economic activities. Large cities have large labor markets, which promote flexibility for both employers and employees. Labor markets, employees can shop for better jobs when they lose a job without having to change their residence, because of availability of much greater choice in terms of jobs in a large city. On the other side, similarly, employers can find new employees, both for expansion and substitution of employees who do leave them. The availability of many people in one geographical area also enables much greater service activities, including entertainment, restaurants, sports, and so many other activities. The income generated from such activities increases demand for both manufactured goods and other services. It is therefore possible that the general Indian policy of locating industries far away from urban centers may reduce the productivity of large cities, along with the loss of urban agglomeration economies overall for the economy and generation of further activity of the kind mentioned above. The ruralization of Indian industry may not be desirable. We need to devise policies so that manufacturing is encouraged in towns and cities, while of course taking care of the negative aspects, that is pollution, harmful emissions, and the like. Large cities also exist because of agglomeration economies that arise from large transport hubs, such as airports, ports, bus stations, railway stations, etc. These facilities create substantive demand for a whole host of services from including other transportation, accounting, financial services, hotels, restaurants, and so on. Similarly, large hospitals and other health facilities cannot exist outside large cities since they exhibit significant economies of scale. Medical specialties need an adequate number of customers, otherwise known as patients, on a regular basis. So who can only be supplied by large cities and their environs. The same is true for entertainment centers like cinemas, theaters, bars, and restaurants. In each case, economic activity begets economic activity, and that is the essence of agglomeration economies. Cities are also centers of knowledge, it's very important, that give rise to new activities, innovation, and new areas of activities in general. Typically, large, great universities, medical schools, technology institutions, business schools, law schools, etc., are typically located and give rise to large, vibrant cities. For example, the metropolitan area comprising of Boston and Cambridge and other towns in the vicinity has essentially arisen out of the location of a number of educational institutions in that area. Within India, which are the cities that are currently seen as vibrant institutions, which other cities are currently seen as vibrant, expanding, and attractive places to live despite their expanding size? Pune, Ahmedabad, Chennai, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chandigarh, Delhi, Mumbai, and possibly Lucknow, Kanpur come to mind. Among other things, what is common among these cities is essentially the existence of large educational institutions, hospitals, and other significant facilities. I'm told that the late Senator Moynihan of the United States is reported to have said, if you want to build a world-class city, build a great university. Then there's the punchline, and wait for 200 years. Deepak, so I think the JNU, hope it lasts us for 200 years, and then we'll have a great city. Large cities, of course, exists for various reasons, but a common characteristic is, of course, the benefits we gain from agglomeration economies. So our attitude should be to celebrate the existence of large cities and to concentrate on how we can make them more livable and productive. And for this to happen, the governance of our cities needs to improve very substantially. So let me talk about governance. I would have talked about the number of large cities we're going to have. Yet, governance of even the largest of our cities continues to be very weak. The overall administrative system of the country is based on the delineation of districts as the basic units of administration, which are governed by officers of the All India Services, Indian Administrative Services, and Indian Police Service. Hence, there is some overlap between the jurisdictions of general district administrations and municipal corporations and local government. The smooth development and administration of large cities needs a much stronger and unified system of governance, as is the case in most large cities in other countries. The mayor or mayor equivalent is the chief executive in charge of these cities, once again something Dr. Sharma mentioned, much as the chief minister is in charge of a state and the prime minister is in charge of the country. In India, however, the mayor is usually a ceremonial head. Can any of you name any mayor in the country? Anyone? I can't. And much of the administrative responsibility is shouldered by the municipal commissioner, who is appointed by the state government from among the IS or provincial service officers, and they are birds of passage in the sense they get transferred all the time. The provision of basic service in the city involves the universal supply of clean water, sanitation, solid waste disposal, power, roads for mobility, convenient modes for transportation, facilities of housing, facilitation of housing, and the like. Many of these have been provided as public goods at some level of government, although some are private goods amenable to user charges. These are then key basic services that must be provided by the city for the welfare of its citizens. Since they're largely public goods, the city government should be empowered and competent enough to supply or facilitate these services for their citizens. Hence, the need for the availability of adequate resources to the city governments. Large Indian cities, and particularly largest ones, have budgets that are larger than some of the smaller states in India and also larger than those of many countries in the world. Yet the administrative capacities and power of the city governments is very weak. technical competence of much of the staff is very low. Yet the governance of such large cities leave much to be desired, and they need much greater competence and powers to administer the city and to have a vision for the development over time. Such a change could effectively make the mayors of some of the largest cities competitors to state government leaders, such as senior ministers and chief ministers. Similarly, the chief administrators of restructured corporations would also be effective competition to senior IAS officers. Hence, there has been no appetite for major city government reforms and restructuring at any level in the country. But if we are to have cities that are dynamic, vibrant, responsive to citizens' concerns, more livable, city governments must be restructured urgently and made much more powerful, competent, and accountable. There really isn't much choice. But this discussion hasn't even begun in our country. We must strengthen our municipal corporations at every level. Many years ago, I was speaking in Mumbai to a very large audience of about 1,000 people that included a few hundred college students. Among others, I also had Mr. Narayana Murthy of Infosys on the panel. So I asked the students to raise hands if any one of them would like to work for the Mumbai Municipal Corporation. I think one hand went up. Then I asked them how many of them would want to work for Mr. Murthy at Infosys. And at least half the students raised their hands. This demonstrates how poor the reputation and prestige is of municipal corporations among our young. This is a real pity to my mind, since shaping and managing cities should be very exciting work compared to working in Infosys, with all due apologies to whoever works in Infosys and the leaders of Infosys. Hence, the rejuvenated city government must include a major campaign to increase their prestige. Since you're all urban experts, may I ask for a similar show of hands, who wants to work for a municipal corporation in India? You're all urban experts, for God's sake. And that proves the point, right? To increase competence, the rejuvenation of city government must include a major campaign to increase their prestige. To increase competence in local governments, they need to be staffed with a whole set of professionals from different areas, such as financial experts, accountants, urban planners, architects, engineers, lawyers, and the like. In view of the huge expansion in education that I referred to earlier, that has taken place over the last couple of decades at the college level, along with the proliferation of professional schools, there is no dearth of talent available for almost all these professions, as it might have been 20 years ago. There's another issue that Dr. Sharma referred to, that you don't have courses to do with urban development planning, etc., in most of our universities. They therefore need also a campaign to include urban management, urban development subjects, universities, business schools, law schools, schools of architecture and planning, etc. Furthermore, since a lot of people wanted to join Infosys, there's increased use of IT in urban governance. So even the IT professionals can go off and do more exciting work in municipal governments. Working in municipal corporations should be seen as exciting and rewarding to attract the youth to shape the future of cities. If municipal corporations are made more powerful and responsible, their sources of revenue must be expanded very considerably. Local government revenue in India as a proportion of GDP is among the lowest among major countries in the world. The property tax in particular is inexplicably not used to its fullest extent. The huge expansion in formal housing, commercial spaces, malls, and a host of other structures is clearly visible to all of us. There is no reason why all such use of land should not be taxed appropriately. If it is, it will be a very dynamic tax, because I think these use of urban land is increasing on a continuous basis and continue to do so for the foreseeable future. The current levels, with the use of information technology, there is no problem now in both the enumeration of all such properties and in the levied property tax on them. The current levels are either negligible or very low, so that many of us, certainly I, don't even know how much property tax we pay. It should hurt me a little bit when I pay the property tax, but it doesn't. If municipal corporations provide a whole host of services that I've mentioned, many services can also be levied user charges. If all this is done, cities would then be less dependent on the devolution of resources from higher levels. As tax income streams become clearer, it will also be possible for cities to float municipal bonds to raise resources for needed capital investment. That, of course, would need much better accounting and transparency in municipal finances so that these municipal corporations can be credit rated for appropriate signaling to the markets. The objective of city governments in this fashion must be to make their cities economic engines, havens of productivity, centers of knowledge, centers of art and creativity, centers of entertainment, and in general, easy and comfortable to live. I'm now coming to about the end, so you can relax a little bit on this Saturday evening. I've been enjoying myself. I hope that so have you. So let me just tilt some issues in the future of urbanization, which I think are very important, and quite frankly, I have not given that much thought to them, but I thought I would raise them. Because many life-changing technologies and events are taking place or are in the offing that may make the experience of urbanization rather different in the years to come. I have placed a great deal of emphasis on the need for large cities and the productivity-enhancing nature, attributed largely to the advantages arising from agglomeration economies. The COVID pandemic and its associated lockdowns necessitated a great deal of work from home. We were forced to do that. In this process, many people even moved away from their places of work to remote locations. Questions are therefore being raised on the necessity of people commuting to work and if there's real need for face-to-face contact in many of our activities. It is reported that in some of the key cities in the world, many office buildings have been vacated by large corporations who are either moving to locations outside big cities or allowing their employees to work remotely. This phenomenon will no doubt have significant effects on the pattern of both employment, residential location in urban areas, and hence on the evolving structure of cities. With the advent of the proliferation of streaming services of all kinds of content that used to be shared experiences in entertainment is now becoming a solitary one. Similarly, it is being said that education at all levels can also be done remotely and more efficiently, precluding the need for students and teachers to congregate at schools, colleges, and universities. Business in law courts could also potentially be done remotely, as is now being enabled by the new Criminal Procedures Bill introduced in Parliament yesterday. E-commerce is also changing the face of commercial retail businesses to the extent that many shopping malls in the United States and other countries are being shut down, while in our country, of course, shopping malls are still in their infancy. We can already see the future happening elsewhere. Food delivery services are also substituting the experience of eating in restaurants with friends and family, now by eating at home with the same food. With a large proportion of books, journals, and other publications having been digitized, there's also no need for people to go to libraries. When I was teaching at Yale University the last few years, almost all course material was available to students in digitized form. In my courses, I thought I would assign lots of books rather than papers so that people would actually have to feel the paper, but even those sections were digitized, so I didn't succeed. The library spaces, which are lovely library spaces at Yale University, were then used by students only to sit with their laptops in comfortable surroundings, much as they do in e-cafes. They didn't go there to get books. They have no need for accessing the articles or books in hard copy, for which we used to go in libraries in the years gone by. Time alone will tell whether these kind of technology-induced changes will alter behavior in the manner that I've just described, leading to unprecedented changes in urbanization and the structure of large cities in the future. My own, perhaps somewhat old-fashioned view is that human beings are social animals, and that after some initial enthusiasm for such isolated activities induced by technology, the demand for face-to-face centered contact and shared community activities will rise again. To some extent, I feel this might happen since one is seeing much more incidence of mental health problems at all ages, including the young. There is no doubt that there will be changes, however, in behavior that will lead to the evolution of urban structures, but they may still be difficult for us to imagine. But we need to keep thinking about this and fashion the evolution of cities accordingly. The other literally earth-shaking phenomenon is, of course, the imminent climate change. Cities in developing countries are already suffering from the ills of widespread pollution caused by different kinds of urban activities, from both industrialization and widespread emission causing transportation. I'm a regular observer of air quality in major cities across the world. I'm particularly impressed by the consistent high level of air quality now in London. I can recall my student days there in London in the late 1960s, when there was a high degree of incidence of smog in the winters, when visibility was sometimes limited. Those of us of my generation were also avid readers of Sherlock Holmes mysteries, can remember the consistent description of smog-covered London in those novels. The transformation of London in this sphere and other cities' advanced economies that has taken place illustrates the power of technology to cope with emerging problems, but things may get worse before they get better. In any case, there is no question in my mind that urban structures need to change, we need to implement effective mitigation measures along with adaptation. This will involve transformative changes in the patterns of urban transportation, building design, methods of cooling and warming, industrial pollution, and emission-reducing technologies. The fact that India is only 35–36% urbanized suggests that we may be better placed to reorder our pattern and structure of urbanization than many countries that are more advanced than us. Something like what happened with cell telecom technology in telephony, because we had succeeded in not having any phones earlier. I believe that the many ills that bedevil of the living experience in Indian cities and the upcoming challenges of the future are within our capability, imagination, and strength of purpose that we can look forward to much more livable cities, places where citizens can walk around safely, can interact with others for both social and economic purposes, have access to parks for recreation, experience, easy mobility, and generally fulfilling and productive urban lives. I actually had much more to say, but then I got tired. But I'm sure you've gotten more tired. So you've been saved because I got tired. Because I would have loved to talk a little bit more about urban transportation and so many other things that one can talk about urban development. Thank you very much.